computer. All right, it's kind of fun to watch the waiting room and one name after the other pops in. Admit, admit, allow me in. Hello, everybody. I am Bill Murphy Jr. I have today with me Kate Sullivan. This is understandably.com. I am finally learning that I should mention that it's a newsletter and that it's a website and you can sign up and subscribe. So understandably.com is the website and the newsletter. Understandably Live is what we're calling this YouTube channel. Of course, this might end up posted places besides YouTube, but happy to have everybody here today. As we start, I just want to remind everybody that we're recording this and we'll probably be posting it online afterwards. So just make sure you're okay with that. We already are recording. So with that, we got a couple more people coming in. Let me let them come in here. Welcome, I'm Bill Murphy Jr. Everybody meet Kate Sullivan, who is just joined the team. Kate, for those of you who haven't met her, who would have? Sorry, let me collect my thoughts here. Okay. As you guys know, maybe you don't know, I have been writing this newsletter for about 18 months. And one of the really cool things that started to happen was readers would reply to the newsletter. And sometimes I would get into long conversations. I would try to respond to everybody. That's a lot harder now than it was in the beginning. But over time, I had some really good long conversations with people. Now, the funny thing is, to me, everybody is just an email address. I don't know anything about any of you unless you decide to tell me. So I've had long conversations and found out that people were, captains of industry, if they still say that. Found out people were in all walks of life. Found out people were students. They were 90-year-olds all over the country, all over the world. So it's been a great experience. Well, let me tell you what happened when we were finally able to ask people to support the newsletter and get a little bit of revenue. I thought I'm going to take all of it, pretty much all of it, and put it towards trying to get a little bit of help, because it's a lot of work doing this every day. And as you guys know, if you've followed the newsletter for a while, I actually ran ads. I put in the newsletter, hey, if anybody knows anybody. And I got about 400 applications, which was pretty amazing. And one of the ones that was clearly at the top was going to be Kate. And part of the reason why, she has a great background, you guys will hear about it. Part of the reason why she was so clearly at the top was that I thought, wait, why do I know that name Kate Sullivan? And the reason I knew the name Kate Sullivan is because Kate is one of these people that I've had great conversations with over the past 18 months without ever knowing much more about her other than an email address. No face to put with the name, no real understanding of her background. But anyway, I'm going to shut up for a second and let Kate introduce herself to all of you. I think you'll find her very interesting. So Kate, why don't you tell everybody about yourself?
Well, all right. We'll start out with the voice that is natural to me now, living in Scotland as an American expat. And then we will reconfigure for anyone who struggles with a Scots accent into my American NPR voice. And we have the news announcer ready to go. So some of that background of mine actually is in professional narration and audiobooks and voice work. So I basically pick up wherever I am and whatever I'm doing, which has always been a lot of fun and helps to make some connections and have some of those long conversations, whether it's voice or email. But I've been reading Understandably since basically day one. I followed Bill over from Ink this morning, actually. So I was there from launch reading this and just loving the newsletter. We ended up having some conversations about grief and loss, and we ended up having a really great conversation about weird jobs and circuitous paths to get somewhere. And then time went on and all of a sudden it's, I'm hiring for this. I went and took a look and kind of said, well, I do have an editorial background. This is a little below my usual pay grade, especially now that I've changed careers, but this is also a person I would want to work with.
Oh,
So I'm just going to shoot a letter over and let's see what happens. Next thing I know, Bill and I have another long conversation. It's the
mhm.
first time we've ever seen each other, first time we've ever heard each other's voices. And by the end of it, we kind of looked at each other and said, did we just, I think we're working together now. Are we
Yeah.
working together? And it's like, yeah, that's a thing we just did.
So why don't you you alluded to the fact that you're in Scotland. Of course, I know why you're in Scotland, and people may have read your bio, do. But tell us why you're in Scotland. How'd you end up in Scotland?
So I came over to do a master's degree in business psychology and then was offered a fellowship placement to stick around to do a PhD in entrepreneurial psychology and what is referred to very esoterically as otiumology, which is basically the study of how we choose to allocate our time and resources. So it's a little psychology, it's a little behavioral economics, it's a little in this weird subfield called serious leisure. Um, and the cool thing is where the term comes from is the Latin otium, which is literally the opposite of work.
Hmm.
So,
I've learned something new in this conversation already. I was about to say I already knew the story. No, I don't know that part of the story. That's amazing.
yep.
Wow.
So I'm here working with basically small entrepreneurs and micro startups to see where they're basically the challenges and the joys of starting a business comes in and how we can make it more satisfying than stressful.
Mhm. And now, just before we let everybody in the room here, I asked how you spent your morning, and you were talking about having discussions on your dissertation, which is,
Yep.
why don't you just, you got to share what that's about. And
So my dissertation is actually on folks who have turned a hobby into a business during the COVID crisis, during the pandemic. Um, and this was not my original topic, obviously.
obviously, yeah.
So I executed a real quick pivot. I had originally been studying hybrid entrepreneurs, who's someone who has a side hustle um, in addition to their day job. And a lot of that evaporated at the start of the pandemic because people were laid off, they were furloughed, or their side hustle dried up. And so I kind of pivoted on that to the people who took the opportunity of being laid off or having a struggle like that to finally turn their hobby into something that they could maybe make a living at.
Hmm.
And it's been really interesting interviewing some folks about just where the struggles are and where the satisfaction is in it. And I mean, this is one of those times where I sit there and go, I don't know how other PhD students do it because they're doing statistics on this and they're doing all of these, really in-depth interviews and they're telling me, oh, it's so hard to get people to talk to me about my topic. And I'm like, I can't get people to stop talking to me. I have 6 hours of transcription to do.
Oh, I can imagine. And so this is at least a second career, probably like a fifth career for you. But
Somewhere
you
in
had a little
there.
bit of
Yep.
time at a newspaper, and you ran a magazine, which is an interesting thing. So when you want to just share a little
Yeah.
bit of that?
So what I've done for work has absolutely nothing to do with what I did in school. I ended up at a small newspaper in rural Massachusetts, the Berkshire Eagle, and sort of earned my chops there doing copy edits and layout for daily news. Went from there to the premier classic car magazine in the US, Hemmings Motor News,
Hmm.
as their managing editor and youngest managing editor in the industry.
Not the magazine
Still not
industry.
entirely certain how that one worked out, but it did. I was there for almost 7 years. Started their social media department, managed 2 magazines, was doing classic car judging and shows and just crazy job, wonderful. Moved from there to Philadelphia to completely remodel Tea magazine. So yes, actually drinking tea,
Okay.
because at the time I had a side hustle as a tea maker. So I was a master tea maker and running a business doing that. Um, Ended up editor-in-chief and content director and completely remaking a what had been a trade journal into a consumer magazine.
Wow.
Went from there into consulting and some business strategy and consumer psychology, and ended up in Scotland as an entrepreneurship researcher and qualified psychologist.
And how long have you been over there now? A couple of years now, right?
4 years.
Long enough for the accent to kind of take over a little
Long
bit.
enough to actually get taken over a little bit by the accent, just so that people can understand me, because
Interesting.
otherwise they're just very confused.
Interesting. So what we want to do here, we do actually, Kate and I talk often now, and we'll just go on and on. But I want to encourage, if you guys have questions about Kate, about me, about what this thing is that we've been building, understandably what the future is, we'll talk a little bit about that too. But I would encourage you, if you can drop it into the chat. I don't know how to do a thing where I could spotlight somebody and have you ask a question on video, but if you have questions, you can drop them in there.
Well, I know we had one about how I knew when to change careers.
Oh,
So I
yes.
think we've got a good segue into that right now.
Yes.
For me, in a lot of cases, it happened organically. So it was just, I started looking at what I was doing in my work versus what the role said it was,
Mhm.
and figured out, wait, I'm not really doing just editorial anymore. I'm not editing magazines. I'm not, doing lit. I'm doing the strategy for this business. And I'm happier doing that. And I seem to be pretty good at it. So maybe I should go look at doing that instead and, see what the market outlook is and see if I can move into that. Lo and behold, that worked. Started figuring out that where the business owners I was working with needed help was not in their craft. It was not in the thing that their business was there to do. It was in all the other stuff that comes with running a business. They're extremely good at their craft. I've worked with beverage companies, I've worked with publishing companies and media startups, I've worked with distillers, a bunch of different businesses. I've worked with a couple of app companies, and with higher ed. And a lot of what people need, they're so good at what they do,
Mm.
but then there's all the business functions and the systems, and honestly, some mental health support for not going crazy when you're trying to do all of this.
It's
And
interesting.
that's kind of where I figured out that my niche is sort of as a business therapist almost.
I can imagine that. Yeah, I wrote a book. I've written 2 books, I guess, about entrepreneurship, one on my own and one with somebody. And one thing I always that struck me was that there were at least 2 kinds of entrepreneurs. And there were entrepreneurs that were passionate about an idea and then wanted to figure out how to make it into a business. And then there were people who were passionate about entrepreneurship and looked at things like, what's the biggest market? What are growing trends? How do I come up with something that could, kind of ride that rocket ship? And whatever biases I brought to this to begin with, I gravitated towards the people that were I have a passion, I want to turn it into a business, which I think might be more your clients and future clients. But it is interesting. I never, just my heart didn't really connect so much with the people that could look at changing demographics and think, I don't know, people are moving to the suburbs. Let's come up with products and services that will, the population is graying. Let's figure out things for older people or something like that. I just never, it took me a while to click into that. But it's interesting if you think about so many of the, so many super success stories really did just look at where the demographics going. But then a lot, I don't know, the more inspiring stories I think are sometimes at least the people who just came up with something because they were really interested in it. So, but they're probably the ones that would be coming to you for help. Right? I mean,
Because, oh God, the accounting, why do I have to do this?
oh God, the accounting and the marketing and the customer relations and the, frankly, this is very meta for me because it's exactly what's happening with Understandably. But I think I mentioned to you, Kate, but I was talking with a guy, um, he does tech in newsletters. Came to it because he's a developer. He's passionate about it, but he wanted to actually involve us in something. I don't know, maybe he'll get involved with us in a different way. But what was interesting was he's actually written a blog for a long time about how he's an entrepreneur who does not want to be an entrepreneur. What he wants to do is create cool tech things and see some of the upside financially, because he'd like to, not just give it all to a bunch of venture capitalists or whatever. But we had a great conversation, and so much came up about, like, I can build this fantastic product. I can do a bunch of things that are really his skills and his passion, but then wind up spending so much time trying to figure out which email newsletters do I market in. I mean, and what's the return on each one, and which one is working for me or not. So I don't know that I have a real point here. This is one of these things that I would have to write down to figure out what I actually think about it.
Well, that actually fits with, something that is one of my little dreams. Is I like to say that basically one of my dream jobs is to be a professional instigator, and to either come up with the idea and then hand it off to someone qualified to actually execute it, because there are not enough hours in the day and there is not enough energy in me to do half the things that I come up with, when I wake up at 4 a.m. and get up in the quiet
Yes.
and, have the brain ticking over. So I would love to be just like a one woman, font of ideas, hand them off to someone else, get a little tiny bit of the upside on that if they've got it,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
But also professional instigator in the sense of having someone with that passion, who maybe doesn't know how to implement it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have some of the business skills on that end, and just give them the little boost or nudge they need to get that off the ground so that they're doing the thing they love. And, I see in the chat, we've got monetization versus passion. And that's absolutely right. But how can we figure out how to monetize your passion in a way that doesn't burn your passion out?
Mm-hmm. It's true.
Make it so that you do love what you're doing, and you won't love it every day, because every job has times that suck.
That's
But
true.
how do we make it so that on the balance, you feel satisfied and sustained, and you're loving what you do and loving what you do in the world, making enough to live the lifestyle you're looking for?
And there's also the practical pieces of it too. It's funny. I hear you almost. I don't know if this is where you're going with it, but what I hear is almost a portfolio model where you're helping a lot of people to develop
Mm-hmm.
their passions and figure out a way for them to make at least an income from it, something sustainable, so they can continue it. But I mean, that's kind of the classic investor model, especially early stage investor, where you're taking risks on a whole bunch of different things. But the interesting thing is, in that case, you're taking a risk on a whole bunch of different things, assuming that only a few of them will work out. I think if I'm hearing you correctly, it's more a notion of trying to provide everybody that's involved with enough of a floor to actually achieve what they're trying to achieve. So yeah.
Give everybody. We're not going to have any unicorns. We're not going to have any billion-dollar valuation.
Yeah.
But if you have enough people feel like they're getting what they need out of their business, and that they have some agency in their life, and they're able to create what they want in the world.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's a unicorn. That's the win. Is if you can get that for more people.
I love that.
And I mean, it's even like what we've seen with Understandably and what you're doing, in the middle of the pandemic and everything else, is figuring out, well, what can I do that makes this both the work I want to do and the people I want to talk to, but also the life I want to live.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here, and I'm going to read it because I think it might spark us off on something we talk about all the time, and frankly, that I would love to hear from other people.
I saw it.
Yeah. The question is, I would love for Understandably to be recorded as an audible newsletter. I'd like to listen to Understandably in the shower or while walking my dog in the morning, my kind of multitasking. So yes, I think, yes, we would love to do something like that. And we're kind of figuring out what is that. As I've kind of said, actually, it's interesting. We have a lot of subscribers now. We have 90,000 free subscribers at this point. We started with We didn't quite start with 0 because probably like maybe 1,500 people followed me over from Inc. this morning on the very first days, but we're up to 90,000 now. Yeah. And it's very funny. I think I mentioned today, even though I look in the analytics and I know that obviously not everybody reads it every day. That would be impossible. But how many paid subscribers? It's a small number. It's not a big number. I don't know if I should say exactly what it is, but it's not a big number. It's almost everybody is free, which I think is the model for most. Actually, I'll talk about that. I'll come back to that. But so it's interesting that we now have a lot of subscribers who probably have no idea who I am really, and I kind of forget that. So train of thought here. Oh yeah. So I wrote for Inc. for a long time. I wrote for different places. I ran their newsletter for a year and then decided, well, I think I'll start my own. And in retrospect, it's kind of a pandemic project, even though it started a little bit before the pandemic, because that's really when I just said, all right, I'm just going to pour everything into this. I'm stuck in the attic anyway, so to speak. But over the course of that year, I think we finally hit a groove, figured out what works, what doesn't. I often say that I have, I'm writing 5 days a week, but I only have 3 really good thoughts a week. So the other 2 we got to really dig deep for. But bottom line, it's a newsletter because that's what I started doing as a newsletter. The truth of the matter is I don't really even read that many newsletters, if I'm being very honest. I mean, I occasionally get responses from people saying, we like this a lot, but a daily newsletter is not the perfect vehicle for it. It's one vehicle, it's not the only vehicle. So we talk a lot about, all right, what else should we be doing? And now, fortunately, I've got a little bit of ability to step back and think more strategically. So right across from my desk here, it says, understandably is not a newsletter. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. We have a newsletter. So far, that's where most people know us from is a daily newsletter. But I think there's just an opportunity to do so many other things and go beyond that. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about, just how that works and some of the things we've talked about. And I'd love to hear more, more from people. You guys are the readers,
Well, and one of those things we've talked about is, basically next step is how do we get a podcast or an audio version up and running? And what would that look like? Would it be the newsletter allowed every day as, the audio version? Would it be including some of the Understandably Live interviews? Would it be some exclusive stuff? Would we have, maybe you can sign up for, do you want the daily newsletter? Do you want the original interviews? What are we going to do with that? And, like with so much with Understandably, there's so many good ideas that we just need to, okay, let's get one running, then try the next one, then try and see what everyone thinks and what, really resonates with folks. And then double down on that one and see where we go.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, it's very, it's funny here. I think I'm coming across a little bit disjointed. In part, it's because there's a lot of things going on, but it is also, I just want to point out, because I'm watching Kate, I'm watching everybody in the room, I'm watching the chat, I'm trying to keep my thoughts, I'm watching the time. It is interesting. So if we seem a little bit unfocused, it's it's more that than that the ideas are unfocused. But an interesting challenge I've had for years is that I get pitched on stories at least 100 times a day. I get both from PR people, from people who've read things. It's a constant stream of things coming in. And there've been a number of times I've thought, well, how do I streamline this? Is there a business around this? All types of stuff. But it is kind of an embarrassment of riches. Now, often you have to have the time to dig through and find, like, what's the really interesting part of the story here? How does it work with what I do? As an example, I might get pitched on some sports related stories that could be really interesting, but I don't really write sports. And I don't necessarily, until I had the newsletter, I didn't have a real outlet where I could write about just whatever was interesting. I get pitched all day long on Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, cannabis, all things that I'm interested because I'm interested in things, but I don't really write about. But it is kind of an embarrassment of riches, and I've often not known what to do with them. So one thing we thought about is if we did an Understandably Live like this, not specifically like this where I'm talking with somebody that I know, but a half-hour interview, and you just know that at 1 p.m. Eastern, barring a act of God or something, there will be somebody that's interesting to come on and talk about. And there won't necessarily be an article afterwards. There might be, but it's not that nobody else is doing this. A lot of people are doing it, but they don't necessarily do the invite other people in to text questions and
The
stuff like
live unscripted version,
that.
as opposed to, and poor Bill has had to put up with me and my, social media fads and things like that, telling him, we got to get you on TikTok. We got to get you on Twitch. We got to get, my generation in here a little bit too. And he's sitting there going, what have I done? Oh, what have I done?
Yeah, I mean, there are a million good ideas, and that's always that's some advice I got a long time ago, was that the problem is not coming up with a good idea. It's having the focus and courage to say no to 99 good ideas, because you really have to get the one done. So I think we're at the point where we've got one done. We've got a pretty good daily newsletter. I think often enough I look back at it and say I'm proud of what we did that day. And on the days when I look back and say, I'm my own worst critic, but on the days when I look back and say we could have done better, usually I can look at it and say, well, I know why we could have done better. And sometimes it's, oh, I made a mistake I won't make again. Other times, quite frankly, it's, well, because the story I was writing for the newsletter kind of fell apart at midnight, so I had to start over and come up with something completely new and write it. Oh, the stories I could tell
Tends
you
to
guys.
end with me on Slack seeing this when I'm waking up and going, Bill, go to bed.
Yes. Yeah.
Please go to bed. It's what, 3 a.m. where you are? Go to bed.
There were too many times of that. There were too many times. And I'll share actually that one of the things that made me say, all right, I need to get help on this, was I had some kind of weird problem with my arm. It's all fine now, but I had to go to physical therapy. And as a result, for a week or so, I could barely type. Now I'm writing I'm writing a newsletter, I'm writing for Inc., I'm writing for Business Insider, basically try to do this. It's all fine now. I don't even know what it was, just getting a little bit older, had a weird little reaction. But I thought, well, gosh, I didn't even have somebody that I could turn to and say, hey, my arm's in a sling for 2 days because I need somebody to write this. So yeah, too many late nights, too much of that. But yeah. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, moving beyond the newsletter, doing these other things. So I'd love to hear what you guys, it doesn't have to be now in the chat or whatever, but I'm always looking for, what are the other things you see, especially if you see things that we stumble onto, and the question is, can you do more of that? So.
And I mean, someone just said, NPR has a similar setup, which is wonderful. You can either click play or you can read the story,
yeah,
depending on what works for you. And I love that as an inclusion thing as well.
mm-hmm,
so, if you have an auditory issue or if you have a visual issue,
mm-hmm.
you can still get, the creator's version of whatever, instead of necessarily like a screen reader. Because I have friends who rely on screen readers
Mm-hmm.
and dictation software for a lot of stuff, and it's just not the same. If you dictate versus type, things come out differently. If you're listening to, the Alexa voice
Mm-hmm.
versus Bill, it has a really different feel.
Very true. So as we rattle off a few things here, so actually I have to thank everybody for giving me a big gift, which is when I did that survey, which I guess was in May. Part of it was asking for a little bit of demographic information just so we could try and get some sponsors. But a lot of it was, I just didn't know. Do people read the essay? Do they read the 7 things? Do they read them both? Do they skim past one, get to the other? And also, it's not a democracy, right? We're not all going to vote on what kind of content it gets in, but but it's good to know if people are largely opening it and saying, oh no, another like Bill's random memory as a launching point for a newsletter, or oh no, not another scientific study, or no, we really do like that. One of the big gifts y'all gave me was that a plurality of people said, what I'd love to see is more writers. And it'd been an internal question. Well, does this have to be me writing it every day? I think it's always got to have my voice. I think it's always got to have me, at least in this role. But it is great to be able to turn to someone like Kate and to bring in outside writers sometimes to do some of that. So that's a big thing. So as we think about things to roll out here, one question is, there are some other, as somebody said with NPR, how much longer would it take for me to record a brief podcast based on the daily newsletter? Even if it's just me, I don't see myself just reading it. I don't think I have it in me to just read it verbatim, but to kind of read it and maybe talk about it a little bit and then just send that off. And if at that point, it's even it's potentially even a daily thing, and it's another audience. There's these videos that we're doing. I actually really enjoy these. I think I don't know if it's obvious, but I'm not the most comfortable person on camera in the world. Zoom is one thing, but even now when I start thinking, wow, we got all these people watching me, and then it's going to be out on YouTube, and you never know, something could blow up. It's just not my natural state, but I'm becoming more comfortable with it, and I'm kind of enjoying them as we go on here. So I don't know if there's a point, just a little bit of insight of what else we're working on here. So Lynn's asking about the Peak. Thank you for turning me on to those guys. I actually subscribe. I've had a conversation with them. We traded a lot of notes. They're fascinating guys. I think they are entrepreneurs of the second category, like we talked about, in that they saw an underserved market, Canadian business news. Anybody who doesn't know the Peak, it's kind of like Morning Brew, if you're familiar with them, only they're based out of Toronto, and they're very focused on Canadian business, and they do a great job with it. It's a different model from what we're doing, but there's a lot of, we compared notes and actually got along really well. And I think maybe we'll do something with them at some point in the future. I'm not sure what, but yeah, I recommend them. This whole thing, the newsletters are I barely know any journalists who haven't thought about doing it. It just feels like it's kind of a stampede over to it. Paradoxically, it makes me think, well, all right, I don't want to just be a newsletter in that case. And I also question whether I'm on the best platform, to be honest. Substack, for those of you who know anything about the platforms, I wouldn't have started this without them, but I do wonder sometimes if it's the best platform long-term to be on. So these are other questions we're looking at.
We have our work cut out for us.
We do indeed. Well, this has been a little bit of a unstructured conversation, but I appreciate it. And the big thing is really, I'm really gratified. It's been amazing for me to build relationships with a lot of the readers. And when I have somebody like Kate, and we have somebody else, Alicia, who I'm going to introduce separately, who's helping out, I didn't just want to do the thing where you never mention, oh, by the way, here's this other person, or you just put a little, superfluous, is that the word, superficial introduction, and you find out, oh, they like cats, or their favorite hockey team is the Boston Bruins or something. I thought, let's do a real introduction, and people want to know who's involved, so you can learn a little bit. So it's a little bit unusual, I think, but I thought it was worth doing. So.
But that's also one of the great things about Understandably that makes it more than a newsletter. It, Understandably is not a newsletter. There's a community there. There's, I had my first byline today, and I spent half of my afternoon talking with people about morning routines and being a morning person or a night person.
Yep.
That's not a newsletter.
True. It is true. And
it's much better than the reader mail that I used to get at the Classic Car magazine. You do not want to say anything wrong to a classic car guy.
Oh, I'll bet.
Oh, you will be taken to school on that one.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is another thing we'll be exploring, because I know that there are ways to leverage this community. Every once in a while, I'll find out. I mean, Kate has a very interesting story, obviously, and I hear occasionally from other people that have these amazing stories that I want to share them beyond just the one-on-one thing that I get. And they're alluded to sometimes, where I could have spent all day reading the comments the other day when people were talking about how they met their spouses. Just the whole array of human stories and that sort of thing. It was just, you could read it all day long, and just thinking, well, how do we provide opportunities for, people to hear from others? It's without doing something like just turning the whole thing over to Facebook and giving up all our our personal information and whatnot, So yeah, good. Well, I think it's better if we leave them wanting more, so to speak.
Oh, we have someone says Scotland's their favorite country. So fantastic, Sarah. It's I love it here. I have, I've been here for 4 years for a reason, and as long as they decide that they'll let me stay. Good. Again, I'm not a native, but I've become a local. So
Well, that's great.
that's something that's really wonderful. And Scotland's just so welcoming.
Now,
It's absolutely welcoming.
I'm going to bring it back and I'm going to ask you a question about the accent, which is just kind of. I remember doing a study abroad program in London, and I had a professor who was an American but had been in London for 25 years or something. And he said that when he was with Americans, they all thought he was British, and when he was among British people, they all knew immediately he was American. I've just wondered, is that where you are at this point?
For me, it's more everyone knows that I'm not Scots,
Uh,
but they're never entirely sure where I'm from. So my accent is slightly on the Gaelic Scots side, but also I spent time down south. So, and I've lived a little bit everywhere. So my default, if I'm not doing NPR consciously,
yes.
my default is actually more of a transatlantic.
Hmm.
This is my natural voice. This is what happens if I'm not thinking about anything. And I'm just tired or my voice goes to default, which is basically Commonwealth.
Got it.
It's a neutral Commonwealth. It's not quite North American. It's a bit Canadian. It's a
Hmm.
bit Central English, and there's an ever so slight hint of South African.
You've got it all.
And
And
it's just, I
did I?
confuse people because they're like, you're Commonwealth, but we don't know where from. So we're just not going to ask more questions. It's best that way.
Got it.
But then if I'm around Scots long enough, it slips back into this and I
Yeah.
can't help it.
Well, when I first was thinking, what help do I need? If you've noticed fewer spelling mistakes and ridiculous copy editing things that need to be done, if you've noticed fewer of those lately, it's because of Kate. And I had this vision. I didn't even know how to possibly find an American expat 4 or 5 time zones ahead of me, so that when I finish this thing at 2 o'clock in the morning, I could hand it off and they could have a leisurely cup of tea in the morning. Well, coffee for me, but since you mentioned tea. And so it really is serendipitous that it worked out like this. So you've done great work and I appreciate it so far. And I hope it's going to be, the beginning of a wonderful working relationship, and that we'll grow here, and that years from now, people will be searching through and trying to think, how did this mega media company get its start way back when during the pandemic? And they'll find this video and they'll say, wow, okay, that's how it all began. So
The guy in his attic in New Jersey
yeah,
and the girl in the spare room in Scotland
yep,
over a pub.
that's how it'll work. That's how it'll work. Good.
Blame Bill and the squirrels.
Yes, yes. We'll talk about ADHD next time.
We'll have a conversation about
Yep.
non-neurotypical and watching the squirrels go
And
by.
and don't
It'll be
let
great.
anybody think that I have forgotten about the idea that when the pandemic was over, we're going to do a meetup, those of us who are within driving distance, in Philadelphia at Billy Murphy's Irish Saloon, which I found and wrote about. So maybe we'll do tours or something. But anyway, hey, thanks everybody for being here today. I hope you enjoyed meeting Kate. And don't forget, it's understandably.com. It's a newsletter. You should sign up there. You should
It's not a
subscribe.
newsletter,
Thank you.
Bill.
It's not. All right, that'll
I
do it.
don't I
Thanks very
don't
much.
heard cats. I heard squirrels.
Yeah,
It's not a newsletter.
that's what we need. It has a newsletter, which you should sign up for. And you should subscribe. And I don't know, what do people do? Like and subscribe? I don't know.
Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell,
Right.
comment on things so that we can talk to you and we can find out your stories and we
Yeah,
can share them with the world. And
that's the
thank you
thing.
for welcoming me as part of the Understandably family.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you being here.